Now that new users can sign up on our site, it's time to give them the ability to log in and log out. We'll start by implementing the simplest fully functional login model, which keeps users logged in for one session at a time, automatically expiring the session when users close their browsers.
In this lesson, we'll take a form like the one shown here, which you've probably seen thousands of times on the web, and actually get it to work. In fact, over the next 2 lessons, we'll be implementing all 3 of the most common models for login, logout behavior on the web. For getting users when they close their browsers, automatically remembering users even after they close their browsers, and optionally remembering users using a Remember Me checkbox. This is by far the most challenging lesson so far, but especially if you've never implemented a form like this before, it's really like magic. You've seen this over and over again, but in this lesson, we're actually going to make this thing work. So let's get started by talking about the basic theory behind this sort of login idea. The basic idea behind login is that once a user is logged in, we'll be able to customize the view, for example, like this. We'll be able to change the links. We'll be able to, for example, have a drop-down menu with a profile link and a logout link. And in particular, and most importantly, we'll be able to remember that state from one page to the next. So if this user, Bruce Tiburon, goes to another page, that new page will also know that he's still logged in. This presents a real challenge because the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP, is what's called stateless, which means that the standard itself does not allow the remembering of that sort of information from one request to the next. This means we have to persist the login status from one page to the next using some other technique. The most common way to do this is using what's called a cookie, which is a small piece of text placed on the browser. And this is used to initiate what's called a session, which is a semi-permanent connection between 2 computers. The process of logging in and logging out will involve creating and destroying these sorts of sessions, which suggests modeling them as a RESTful resource, something like users. Except unlike users, they won't be backed by the database. Instead, they'll be backed by this cookie that will be placed on the browser. This means we'll have to do some custom development because by virtue of not being database backed, we won't be able to use Active Record to manipulate sessions. Let's get started by checking out a topic branch. I'm here on the master branch, so let's check out a login, logout branch. Because we'll be thinking of sessions as a RESTful resource, we'll need a controller to create and destroy them. So let's start by generating a controller for sessions. Remember, these are plural, these resources. And we're going to use a new page, just like we did for new users, being the sign up page. The login page will be for creating a new session. So let's create a new view along with the controller. You might have noticed that I made a typo there. So I got a message here saying that I couldn't find such a generator. So I need to spell controller right to get this to work. Let's take a look at a mock-up to see where we're going with this login form. So this is the initial login form. Of course, we'll end up adding this Remember Me checkbox later in the lesson, but for now, we're going to start with the 2 fields, email and password, and then just a login button. We'll also put a sign up now link just in case the user hasn't already signed up for the site. This will generally follow the same model as the sign up form, but the routes are going to be different. So let's take a look at that. Recall in the last lesson that we added a line called resources users. This supports the routes for all of the standard REST actions for users, so that's things like creating, destroying, updating, new, and so on. But for the sessions resource, we're only going to use named routes. So we're going to define 3 routes corresponding to new, create, and destroy. So the new page will be a GET request, just a regular browser hit. And we're going to route that to the login page. So this will give us a helper, login path and login URL. That's going to be routed to the sessions controller and the new action, just like this here. You can compare this to the sign up route. Now remember, to create a resource, you post to a URL. So if you post to login, we're going to route that to sessions create. So that's the sessions controller create action. And then if we issue a delete request, that's going to destroy a session. So this is a new kind of request. We haven't talked a lot about delete, but this is the kind of request used to destroy an object. So in this case, we're going to destroy a session. So we'll route that to sessions destroy. And I'd like to line these things up, so let's line up compared to delete here. This makes the structure a lot clearer, I think. We can also move this over, line everything up. There we go. So these are the 3 routes for the sessions form. This is going to be the login page, and then we'll post to the same login route, and that will be routed to the create action. And then we'll have a logout link as well, and that will be routed to the sessions controller destroy action. Let's take a look at a table just to reinforce this idea. This is the table of the kind of HTTP request, the URL, the named route, the action, and the purpose. So this is what we've just created in this routes file. One nice thing you can do in Rails is take a look at all of the routes. We've just defined these. So you might wonder, well, what if I forget what the correspondence is between, say, these requests and the named routes? And the answer is you can type rake routes. This will tell you the routes that are defined by the current application. Take a look at this here. So here is the section that defines the sessions right here. And this has all the other routes as well, including the standard REST actions for users that we get from including resources users in the routes file. Now that we've defined the routes, let's create the login form. This will be very similar to the sign up form from the last lesson. So let's recall what that looks like. This is the new users here. So what we want to do is have something similar for the new sessions. In fact, we can start just by copying this. Let's do that. And think about what the differences will be. Well, this will be login. Provide a title, login, and the same thing here. We're going to use the same basic HTML structure, so we can just copy these divs. But there's going to be a difference in here with the form for. So you might think, well, we're going to create an @session variable in the controller, the session controller, and then create a form for manipulating that session. But that won't work because this has to be an active record object to use this sort of form for @user. In particular, among other things, because this is an active record object, this form over here, this user sign up form, knows to create a form that posts to /users, the user's path. But in the case of sessions, because it's not an active record object, we're going to have to tell Rails which path to use. So what we're going to do is we're going to give it a symbol, which is the kind of object we're creating, or the kind of object that this form is for. And then we're going to give it a URL. In this case, remember looking here, it's going to be the GET request is going to go to the login path. So let's do that here. So this is how you make a form for something that isn't an active record object. Also recall that these error messages here rely on this @user.errors.fullMessages. But again, this only applies to an active record object. So we're not going to be able to render the errors for the sessions using the same technique. We'll see in a moment what we're going to do. But we need to delete this for now. Oh, and actually, I said something wrong before when we were looking at this table. It's actually not this login path here. It's the one here. It's the same named route, but this here works because of this route. Because of this here. This form for is going to create a form that will issue a post request to this path. So it's true that it's the login path, but it's not this one. It's not the one that responds to a GET request. It's this one, the one that responds to a post. Let's continue on down the file. We've got f.labelName. Take a look at our mockup just to remind ourselves. What we've got on this login form is email and password. So let's get rid of name, keep email, keep password, and we can get rid of confirmation. Instead of create my account, let's have it say log in. And then remember from the mockup, we want to have a link to the sign up page. So let's do that. That goes outside the form. We'll put it inside a paragraph tag. And then we'll link to the sign up path. Save it, and now let's take a look at it. At this point, you might be tempted to try clicking on login, but of course that doesn't work yet. It's just this little hash symbol. We will be filling this in this lesson, of course, but for now, let's just go to /login. Just type it in directly. You can see I've set the browser to remember the email and password here, so those are pre-filled. But this is the basic login form, so you can see it's essentially working. It's pretty close to the mock-up. Got login, email, password, login button, and the link there. Let's take a look at the HTML for this thing. Here's the form. You can see that the action is /login. That's because of this here, login path. And the method is post. That's just something that comes automatically from form 4. And let's take a look at the form itself. So again, there's this stuff you should probably ignore. And then we've got a label for the session email. And then there's an input field for the email, an input field for the password, and then the button. And again, because of this f object, this thing here, this form object, which now refers to a session, and because we're doing f.textField and so on, we get things like name equals session of email. So that's how Rails is going to build up a params hash and will let us pull out the email and password to initiate a new session. That is to say, to log a user in. Of course, we'd like to submit this form as soon as possible to see what it does. So let's take a look at the sessions controller. Let's see what the state of it is now. Right, we've got this new action because of the generate command we ran. And we're also going to want a create and destroy action. So let's think about what is create going to do. We can look at the user's controller, just to remind ourselves. Remember, with the create action in the user's controller, we started off with this render new. On a failed creation, we just render back the new page, which in this case is the sign up page. So we'd like to do the same thing here. So let's just start off, render new. Of course, we're going to change this once we actually start logging users in. While we're at it, let's make a destroy method. So let's take a look at the effect of that. If I click login, something should actually happen. There we go. You can look at the debug information here at the bottom. We've got this params hash session is the key, and then it has another hash inside it, key value pairs, email, and password. Let's put a debugger in here. Refresh this here. Remember what this does, this gives us a nice little prompt here in the server window. Let's take a look at the params hash. So this is params, so params of session. Actually, will this work? Wow, that does work. That's cool. If you look here, it looks like it's a string, but apparently we can actually access this using the symbol session. So this is the params that will end up in this create action. That's where we put the debugger, right? So in particular, we can do this. We can pull out the email with params of session of email. If you think about what's involved in logging a user in, what we're going to need to do is find the user first by this email address, and then authenticate the user using the password. So that will make use of the user model from lesson 6. We can actually do it right here. User.find of this params of email should return the first user. This is just hanging though, so I think maybe we don't have access to the database inside this debugger. Just unfortunate. Oh, we do have it. That's weird. So why didn't that work? Oh, we need to not find of params, we need to find by the email. There we go. This should work. There we go. Great. So this line here will let us pull out the user based on the email address, and then we can use the authenticate method, like this. To see if the user is authenticated based on the password. And that will be params of session of password. Remember, authenticate actually returns the user and not true or false, but in a Boolean context, that means that this is true. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if the user is not nil, so that we can just say if user. Remember, nil is false. So if the user and user.authenticate, let's paste this in here. This combination will be true if and only if the user exists in the database based on the email address and the user is authenticated. So this is a little bit complicated, this line, but this is very idiomatically correct Rails in terms of the way that you would ordinarily pull a user out of the database and authenticate it based on a login form submission. So if user and user.authenticate, if this is true, well, actually what we want to do is evaluate this in a Boolean context. So let's just do bang bang. So this is actually the right user. This user exists and it's authenticated, so this should be true. There we go. So this is how we're going to log a user in. So let's paste that into our controller. So user.findBy email of params. Here we go. So get rid of this debugger line. So the create action will create a new session by first finding the user, and then if this is true, then we'll log the user in. And redirect to the user show page, or the profile page. Else, we're going to render new, and we want to create some sort of error message. Remember, we can't do that with the error message as partial, but we'll do something else that'll be almost as good. All right, so this is the basic structure of the create action. And so all we need to do now to handle a failed login attempt is to create an error message here. Let's take a look at a mock-up of the planned error message. So this is what we're going to do. We're just going to render a flash message here. Let's use the danger key to indicate that this is something potentially dangerous. Someone could be trying to break into someone's account. But really it's just that that's the best color, I think, in this context. It's the red color. So recall actually from the user's controller, we did flash success, welcome to the sample app. Here we're going to do flash of danger equal to invalid email password combination. Let's go try an invalid login. We need to release this debugger here. Control D, and then go here. It looks like somehow this killed my server, so I'm not sure what's going on here. Let's restart it. Let's try this again. There we go. So let's submit invalid information here. Just do a blank email and password. Great, it looks like it worked, right? So we've got this nice flash message. But there is a problem. There's a subtle bug here, and we can see the problem by clicking on another link. Let's go to the home page. So this little note still appears. You may wonder what's going on there. The whole point of the flash is it's supposed to persist for only one request. The issue here is that before we redirected, this is flash success. This arranges for the flash message to appear after the redirect, because this is a new request. But here, we're actually just rendering the new page. And that is not a new request. So as a result, this flash persists until the next request, which is, in this case, the click that I made. We'll fix this in a moment. It's actually really simple to fix, but this is exactly the sort of thing that's a very subtle bug. And it's so easy to forget about it or to have it regress sometime in the future. So this is a great case for writing a short test to catch this behavior, have the test go red because of the bug, and then fix it and go green. So let's generate an integration test for users login. And now we want to write a test that captures the behavior that I just did, which is to say to submit invalid information to the login form and then click over to a different page. So let's do that. I need to refresh it, looks like. There it is. So let's write a test. Log in with invalid information. Oops, I forgot the do. There you go. So let's start by visiting the login path. So that's a get login path. While we're at it, let's make some other assertions to specify the right behavior. So this here should render the template sessions new. This is nice because we've got login path, which doesn't have the controller and action, but by asserting the template, we essentially document the behavior of our application. Let's switch over to the guard window here, and we can save this and see that it's green. Now I want to post, using the post method, to the login path. And I want to give it a hash here. So the key is session, this is the params hash. Email is blank, password blank. And it should render the same template, right? It should render new again. That's right here. And what we want to do here is make some sort of assertion associated with the flash. So my favorite way to do this is not to test even the key, and certainly not the value. Because maybe I want to change this to warning instead of danger, or maybe I want to change the wording of this. But I certainly don't want the flash to be empty, so let's make an assertion for that. And then I want to visit another page, so let's just get the root path. That's what I did over here when I clicked on this, did logo. And now what I want is for the flash to be empty. So what happened here is the flash wasn't empty on that second click. So we just want to save this, and this should be red because we're trying to catch that bug. Great, and now the fix is really easy. There's a special case of flash called flash.now for exactly the situation where we're rendering something rather than redirecting. So if I save this, it should be green. Great, so now we can be confident that if we should ever somehow change this, or if someone came in and changed this to warning, but forgot to put the flash.now, it'll immediately go red. Just for completeness, we can run the whole test suite to verify we're green, and then we can move on to the next step. Great. Now that we can handle invalid login attempts, it's time to actually log in the user successfully by filling in this section of the create action. The code in the action will actually be quite simple because we're going to push most of the complexity into a bunch of related methods, starting with a method called login. What these methods have in common is that they're all related to sessions, so we're going to put them in a module. This is a helper. We've talked a little bit about helpers before. App helpers. So we saw in the last lesson the users helper. We created this gravatar for helper. So I mentioned the word module though, as you can see here, module users helper, module sessions helper. So these modules are a way that Ruby lets you collect a bunch of related methods and then include them into a class. So what we're going to do is include this into one of our controller classes, and in this case we're going to want the sessions helpers to be available everywhere. So the way to do that is to include it into the application controller. It's the base class of all of the controllers. Right, the way to include a module is the include keyword. And with that little bit of preparation done, we're ready to start writing the code to log users in. I mentioned that the code and the action would be very simple. Let's just take a look at it. It's going to look like this. We're going to log the user in and then redirect to the user's profile page. Or we can do redirect to user. By the way, you might remember that in the user's controller, we did something similar here. But here we've got an @user, and the reason for @user is because we needed the user on the form. So we needed an instance variable. But here we're not actually going to render a form associated with this user. So the general rule is that if you don't need an instance variable, you should just use a regular local variable like this. And so this is the full implementation, but of course the problem is that login is not defined. So that's the task of this next section, is to figure out how to log a user in. Rails comes with a special method for creating sessions, so let's do this here. Let's look at the sessions helper again. And let's define a method called login, corresponding to this right here. And the login method will take in a user object, and then the way to create this session is to use this special method called session. So what we're going to do is we're going to treat this special thing, this session method, like a hash, and we're going to give it a key of the user's ID and a value equal to the ID. Now, this is not the sort of thing you would ordinarily want to expose to the outside world. In our case, the IDs are actually exposed in the URLs, but potentially this could be something that's secret, or maybe we decide we don't want to tell everyone in the world how many users have registered for our site till we switch over to some more obscure ID. We would not want to put this in the session necessarily. So the way that sessions work is that this method here puts a cookie on the browser. Now the terminology gets a little complicated here because there's also a Rails method called cookies. So this session helper creates a special kind of cookie. It's what I'm going to call a temporary cookie, whereas the cookies method will create permanent cookies or potentially permanent cookies, which I'll sometimes refer to as persistent cookies. Now, because of the way session works, it actually encrypts this user ID, and so that problem I mentioned before will not occur. This user ID will not appear in the browser in any form that can be read. So what this does is places a temporary encrypted cookie with the user's ID on the browser, and then on the next page, it decrypts that ID, and we're going to use it to retrieve the user from the database. That may sound complicated, but it all happens automatically by virtue of this session method. By the way, you might notice this is just one line, so we in principle could have just put that right here. But I like the idea of having some sort of abstraction layer because you never know, this might get more complicated over time. Or we might end up reusing this method, and in fact that will happen later in this lesson. This is actually working now. Let's take a look at our browser here. Log in. Oops, that's right. And I clicked that link. We're going to fill that in. For now, we have to actually type it in. And now let's log in. Click here. So it actually worked. It redirected. But of course, there's not actually any indication that we're logged in. And if we go here, it's the same home page. The login link is still here, but which we wouldn't normally expect if we're logged in. But we can actually look at the cookies. Click here on Content Settings, and then look at all cookies and site data. And you can see here we've got two cookies. Let's take a look at this. We've got the sample app session. And this is the encrypted version of the cookie. So what we did is we put this in here. Right, session of user ID is user.id. This here is the encrypted version of that. So this is the session that's been created by session of user ID. We'll have to be more careful with the cookies helper because that does not encrypt the cookies, but the session method is safe and uses a very strong encryption scheme to encrypt the information. Now that we've successfully placed the user's ID into the session, the next step is to make a method to retrieve that user on the next page. So let's define a current user method. Because we put the ID in the session like this, we can pull it out using the same code, and so we can just return this current user using user.find. And in fact, we could do this, but remember this raises an error if the user doesn't exist, so it's a little nicer to return nil instead. So we can do user.find by ID session of user ID. So what this is doing is this grabs the information from the browser in the cookie, decrypts it, and then pulls out the user ID. So this works. This actually is a working current user method. But the usual convention in Rails is not to hit the database unless we really have to. So we might use this current user method multiple times on a particular page, say on a particular request. But this hits the database every time. So the usual convention in Rails, and indeed in Ruby, is to use an instance variable like this and say the current user is equal to this if the current user isn't nil, or if it is nil rather. So remember, instance variables are nil if they haven't yet been defined. So if the current user is nil, let's define it, else just return it. This is a particular case of a general technique called memoization, which involves remembering a value so that it doesn't have to be recalculated on subsequent invocations of a function. Incidentally, that is not a mispronunciation of the word memorization. It's a technical term. It's memorization without the R. This method, as it currently stands, is perfectly functional, but it's not idiomatically correct. So let me show you the right way to do this. There's a cool technique. We can do this. We can say, actually, let's delete this here. So the way to get this to work is say that we want the current user to be equal to the current user if it exists. But if this is nil, then we can use the OR operator like this. So this will also work. This is the same thing. Current user equals current user, but if this is nil, then this is false, and then this thing gets evaluated here, the second part, and that will then assign the result of executing user.findBy. But if you look at the structure of this, this is similar to something like x equals x plus 1. There's a variable, and then another variable, and then an operator. And in Ruby, x equals x plus 1 can be summarized like this. You can write a short version. It's plus equals 1. These two things are the same. This is an increment operator, x plus equals 1. And so there's a similar way of doing this in Ruby. We can take this, the operator, which in this over here it's plus. We can take the operator and do or equals, and then get rid of this. So I built it up piece by piece there because this is kind of weird looking. At current user or equals user.findBy ID session of user ID. But this is a very characteristically Ruby line. So you will encounter this in other contexts, and it's important to know about the or equals operator for that reason. So this helper will let us find the current user in the database and then do things like change the site layout based on the existence of that user. At this point, we're finally ready to actually make use of the user's logged in status. Let's take a look at a mock-up here. We saw this briefly before. So this is the kind of thing we'd like to see after a successful login. In particular, you can see that we've got a change in the link. So here's home help login. Here we've got home help users, and then an account link and a little drop-down menu with the profile link, settings, and log out. The way we're going to get that is by first defining a helper called logged in. It's a Boolean, so logged in question mark. So def logged in, and this will be true if the user in the session, that is to say current user, is not nil. So let's do that with bang current user dot nil question mark. So if the current user is nil, the user is not logged in, so bang of that just negates it. So if the current user is not nil, then the user is logged in. We can make use of this in the site layout. Let's take a look at that. Remember, the layout's in application.html.erb. And the main thing we want to do from the mockup is to change these links in the header. So let's open up the header. It's actually here, this guy. So it turns out we don't need the layout, we just need the header. So these links will be common to the two cases, but we only want to show the login link if the user is not logged in. So let's do that. If logged in, we'll put this in a moment. Else, this. Can save that, and actually we should take a look at this. This link here should disappear because we are logged in right now. And there it goes. You can see that link disappeared. So this is now putting to use this this login or logged in method. So now let's make some links for the case of a user being logged in. Do this here. Make a link to the users. This will eventually be a listing of all the users on the site. But we don't actually have that page yet, so I'm just going to stub it out for now. And then I'm going to make that drop-down menu. So this is some special Bootstrap code. So li, this is a class of drop-down. Here we're actually going to put in a stub link, but this is not a stub for what will be filled in. This is actually something that indicates that there isn't an href. This is actually being manipulated using Bootstrap's JavaScript. We'll see how to include that in a moment. Again, this is specific to Bootstrap, this data toggle. And let's make a link here. It's going to say account. Let's make it bold. It's actually an empty tag here. Again, this is specific to Bootstrap. So we finish that link. Now let's put in actually ul.dropdown menu. And let's link to the profile. We're just filling in this stuff here. Profile settings. So the profile is going to be a link to, so you put link to in here. It's going to be a link to the user. And that user we have right here. The user is current user. So what we can do here is, we could do this. We could do user path of current user. But as with redirects, in this context, we can omit the user path part. We can just say link to profile current user, and Rails knows what to do with that. It converts this automatically to the right path. Now let's make a link to the settings. We haven't made this yet, so I'll just stub it out. Put in a divider. And now I'm going to link to the logout. So you put link to. And we actually do have a path for this. Recall we've got logout path, named route. So let's put that in. Of course, it doesn't work yet, but the route works. And because this is a delete request, we have to actually tell Rails that in the link. You need to say that this is a method delete that arranges for this link to issue the right kind of request. All right, let's save that and take a look at our page. Oh, it looks like there's a syntax error. Oh, right, it says users there. So this should be link to. You probably noticed that, but I did not, obviously.
Cool. Now you can see that we've got this users link, again, just stubbed out, and we've got this account drop-down menu. If you click on this, you can see that it gives us this stub here, and that's from this here. And we'll turn that into a working drop-down menu in the next section. In the last section, we added all the HTML needed for this account menu, but it doesn't work yet. If I click on it, nothing happens. In this section, we're going to use JavaScript to get that menu to work. Let's take a look at a file called manifest.js, and then also at our application layout right here. Now, the way Rails handles JavaScript has changed quite a bit over the years. But the latest iteration is probably the best. It uses something called import map. So we need to install import map and then a couple of Rails-specific JavaScript libraries which are part of the Hotwire framework. Now, ordinarily, these are installed automatically as part of Rails new, so you might already have these depending on how you created the sample application. But the current version of the tutorial standardizes on skipping the first bundle step. That's for compatibility with various versions of Bundler. The way that Rails works is that it uses the most recent version of Bundler on the system by default, but that might not agree with the version of Bundler used in this tutorial. So that's why we skipped it before, but that means now we need to install these libraries by hand. So let's go here. It's Rails import map install with a colon, and then turbo and stimulus. We will be using turbo in this tutorial. We will not be using stimulus directly, but it's a good idea to include it just for completeness. Now you may even have noticed that this line appeared. So this includes the necessary JavaScript libraries into our application layout. And here, these two lines have been added automatically as well. Now we'll start with an overview of how we're going to approach this problem, and then we'll get into the details. Step 1 will be to define behavior for a CSS class called active, which will apply to the menu to make it visible. It will be added right here. Step 2 will be to create a new custom JavaScript directory and a file called menu.js to contain the JavaScript that will dynamically add the active class right here. Step 3 will be to edit menu.js and actually add that code. Step 4 will use import map to tell Rails about the custom JavaScript directory. And step 5 will be to import menu.js into the JavaScript for our application called application.js. All right, let's look at the first step, which involves adding some CSS. Let's go to the bottom here and add some CSS for the drop-down menu. If we look over here, we've got a class drop-down menu. If we have that class and the class active, we're going to change the display to block. And as we'll see, that will actually cause the menu to expand. So drop-down menus for the drop-down menu class and then .active. So if it has both of these classes, we'll apply the rule display block. Now this class doesn't appear anywhere yet, so let's create the JavaScript that will dynamically add it right here. That brings us to our second step, which is to create a directory and file for the JavaScript. Call it custom, and then let's touch the file. We'll call it main.js. This brings us to step 3, which is the hardest of the steps, especially if you haven't got a lot of experience with JavaScript, maybe not any experience. So I'll walk you through it. We're not going to go into too much detail here because this is not a JavaScript tutorial, but if you're interested in learning more about these techniques, you can take a look at Learn Enough JavaScript to be Dangerous. This is the comment character in JavaScript, 2 slashes. We'll say, what are we going to do here? Add toggle listeners. Now, the way we're going to approach this is we're going to attach what's known as a listener to a particular element on the page. In this case, this one right here, the one corresponding to the ID drop-down menu. Notice this has both an ID and a class with the same name. So the basic strategy is to find that element on the page and attach a piece of JavaScript that will listen for a click. And when that click happens, it will add this active class that we just defined. Now, in order to attach the listener to the element in the header, we actually have to wait for the entire document to be defined. So we can do that by adding a listener to the document itself. Now, the default event corresponding to loading the document is called DOM content loaded. That's the document object model content loaded. This is a little weird. We give it a function with no arguments, and then we define our code. Now, this won't actually work here, though, because of Turbo. You saw that we added the Turbo library recently, and we'll be using that later in the tutorial. But that changes how the DOM gets loaded, so we have to change this here to turbo::load. And JavaScript lines end with semicolons, so let's add this in here. All right, now what we're going to do is define a variable called account corresponding to this account tab right here. That's this. So that's this here. So we're going to add a listener to that menu item. Now there are several ways to define variables in JavaScript. For the latest version of JavaScript, what we want to do is use what's called the let keyword. So we're going to let the account equal this. In Ruby, we wouldn't have to add an extra word here. We just say account equals. But here we say let account equals. Document is an object that represents the whole document. And now we're going to use a really powerful JavaScript method called query selector. And we'll give it, in this case, the CSS ID corresponding to the elements. See that here? ID equals account right here. So now let's add a listener. Same thing as here, add event listener. And it's going to wait for a click event. We give it a function, which takes an argument, which is the event itself. This is just a JavaScript object. Again, it's not important to know all the details here. Put in the semicolon. And now there are a couple of details that are really hard to guess. This just takes lots of experience, lots of Googling. In this case, I asked LearnNative co-founder Lee Donahoe for some help as well. So one thing we want to do is prevent the default behavior, which is ordinarily to click through the link. But we don't want to click through the link. That would lead to this URL right here, this stubbed out URL right here, this little hash symbol. But we don't want to do that, so we're going to prevent the default. And we're also going to prevent it from propagating deeper into the document. The truth is I barely know what this does, but what I do know is that if you don't put this in, it doesn't work. Probably. Actually, we can test that at the end. All right, now let's pull out the menu itself. You can see here, we mentioned before that there's an ID drop-down menu. So let's let the menu equal, again, query selector. And now the ID is drop-down menu. And now we're going to use some really nice JavaScript. We're going to look at the class list for this menu item, and we're going to toggle the active class. So what that means is that if there is no active class, it will add it, and if it is present, it will remove it. And so that will let us activate and deactivate the menu by clicking subsequent times. So this is the class that we just created right here, or whose behavior we created. So right now we're adding it and removing it corresponding to clicks. Okay, I'm going to save that. We'll see in a moment whether it works or not. But first we need to do step 4, which is to tell Rails about this custom JavaScript directory. It's right here. There's a file called import map in the config directory. You can see here. Right here. Now this is a great example of technical sophistication. Even if you didn't know how to do it, you can say, I can just copy from here. Instead of app JavaScript controllers, we can do app JavaScript custom. I like to line these up. By the way, this is also a great example of technical sophistication. Being able to generally follow along in a language you haven't necessarily studied is a really good skill to cultivate. Okay, our final step, step 5, is to look at application.js. And import custom/menu. And now these configuration changes are exactly the kind of thing that generally would require us to restart the Rails server. So let's look over here. First of all, we have to refresh. With JavaScript changes, you always have to refresh. But I think it's still not going to work. Right. So I'm clicking here, nothing's happening. So let's go and restart the server. Oh, still not working. This is a good chance to debug. Let's inspect it and look over here. It says unable to resolve specifier custom menu. Oh, and maybe you noticed this. I did not. I used the wrong name. I called it main.js. So let's undo that. All right, let's see if that worked. Okay, we may have to restart the server again. Aha! And now it worked. So you see, absolutely everything has to go right, even one little thing. In this case, it's a pretty big thing. It's just the wrong file name. But there are all kinds of things that can go wrong here. So do not be surprised if it doesn't work. If you can't get it to work, I suggest retracing your steps and make sure you're following every step in the tutorial exactly as written. You can see, even I didn't do that. It's so easy to make a little mistake like that. But the result is this beautiful menu. If you click it twice, it goes away, once, and again. And so I said we were going to do one more thing. Let's go to app, JavaScript custom, find our file right there. And I'm not sure about this. I'm going to comment this out with command/. Let's see if this works. Now, this is just a change to the JavaScript. I should not have to restart the server, although I might do it just for completeness. Okay, does this still work? It still does work, it seems. Okay, it looks like that does work. We might not need that line. Get rid of that here. Actually, you know what? Let me take a look at that. I think it might just be to keep the URL clean. So right now, you can see it ends with /. If I click this, no, that works. I think it's good. I don't think we need that extra line. All right, I'm going to remove that line. If things stop working mysteriously, you might want to add it back in. Also check the text, because if it turns out that is necessary, I will put it back in the text. But I think it'll work without. Actually, let's triple check that that's actually being executed. This is a nice trick for JavaScript. Yeah. So I added in an alert. So it says, hello. I just wanted to confirm that, in fact, the change had gone through. Okay. So this is the final code. Now we've got a working menu. Oh, we sort of refresh here. And there we go. All right, in this section, we're going to build on what we did in the last section, where we got this menu working, this little drop-down menu. In particular, we're going to update the design of the site to work well on mobile devices. Now, to get started with this mobile styling, we're going to take a look at how the site appears on a mobile device. There are various ways to do this. The most convenient is to simulate a mobile device in our browser. In Safari, we can go to Develop, enter Responsive Design Mode, like this. This lets us choose from a variety of different devices and orientations. Now, I should note that this isn't a true simulation. It is possible to run an iOS simulator on macOS. You can also deploy the app and look at it with a real mobile device. And it's a good idea to do both of those eventually. And the full iOS simulator is covered in Learn Enough CSS and Layout to be dangerous. But this is going to be good enough for now. So looking at this, you can see that there's a real problem here. This doesn't look good at all. There's this big space up here, this big block of the black background. This works if you click on it, but it doesn't look very good. So we'll take care of this menu first. Let's take a look at our application layout. I just want to draw your attention to this line here, this viewport line. This should be automatically generated, but if it's not, you should add it now. And let's look at our header and use a menu style that looks better on mobile devices. We'll be using what's called a hamburger menu because of its unintentional resemblance to a hamburger. Let's go to nav here. And we're going to put in a div class navbar header. And we'll define a button. So type button. Some of these classes are defined by Bootstrap, including collapsed here. This is a minimal screen reader class here. The subject of accessibility is really important, but it's quite complex and in its full generality is beyond the scope of this tutorial, but I do suggest looking into it at some point. Let's add in some spans with the class icon bar. I want 3 of these for the hamburger. And let's update this here. Let's give this a class collapse and navbar collapse. All right, and let's give it an ID as well. We're going to pull it out of the document. This is for the sake of JavaScript. We saw in the last section how it's convenient to use the ID to find an element on the page using query selector. Okay, I think that's all the HTML structure we need. Let's take a look at the menu. Aha, it's a lot better. Look at that. So if I click on it, it doesn't work. So we have to fix that up. We can also see the footer now. You can see it doesn't look very good. We'll take care of that at the end of this section. So to get this menu working, when we click it, we'll work in the same menu.js file we defined in the last section. And in fact, let's just start by copying things. This sort of copying is a bad practice in general. This violates the don't repeat yourself principle, but it's a great way to get started, and you can always refactor later. And in fact, there's an exercise on eliminating this duplication. But this is good enough for now. So let's change account to hamburger. To copy that and just paste it in here. So that's from this menu right here. Where is it? Right here, the ID equals hamburger. And then we want hamburger here as well. And then the name of the menu is not drop-down menu, the ID is navbar, right? It's right here, navbar menu. So copy that. And instead of toggling it to be active, this is actually something from Bootstrap. We can make it collapse. We're going to toggle collapse. It starts off collapsed, and then we're going to uncollapse it. So let's refresh this and see if this works. There we go. Look at that. Cool. Now we've got the footer, and that's a pure CSS fix. Here's the footer, and let's do this here. We're going to use a technique called a mobile media query. This is covered in more depth in Learn Enough CSS and Layout to be Dangerous. And what it'll do is it will apply certain rules if the width is narrower than a certain pixel width. So it's like this, at media. .800 pixels is a good breakpoint. That's what it's called. It's a breakpoint. Anything less than this, it will invoke these rules. Again, it's not all that important to know where these rules come from right now. This is not a design tutorial, but again, Learn Enough CSS and Layout covers all these kinds of rules. And this should be indented an extra level here. You can see here that these are lined up, but they shouldn't be. They should be indented. So it's actually this here as a hint. There we go. It would work either way. CSS is not sensitive to white space, but this is nice for us. As humans, we get to see how it's formatted. And refresh it. Take a look at this here, so keep your eye on the footer. Ah, a lot nicer. So now it's stacked vertically, which makes a lot more sense when the horizontal space is at a premium. Mobile styling is a big subject. Again, I've mentioned a couple times before the CSS and Layout tutorial from Learn Enough. That's a tutorial that I wrote with Lee Donahoe, and he's the real brains behind that operation. So there's a lot more detail in that tutorial about mobile styling, but this is a great start. This looks nice now rather than an awkward menu taking up the top of the screen and poorly formatted links in the footer. Now we've got something that looks pretty good. Of course, it's cumbersome to have to verify this sort of change by hand, so let's write an integration test to verify that the links change when users log in. Go to our users login test. Here it is, and go to our guard window, or tab. And let's see, instead of test login with invalid information, let's do this. Let's do with valid information. And this first thing is the same, this login path, but then pretty much everything else is different. So let me get rid of this here. Well, we're going to do something here. Get rid of these here. So we are going to post the login path, but what we want in this case is a valid email and a valid password. That is to say, an email address that actually corresponds to a user in the database and a password corresponding to that user. But here we have a problem because we don't have any users in the test database. So the way to solve that problem in Rails is to use what's called a fixture. We saw this briefly before in lesson 6 where we had to eliminate the fixtures in order to get the test to pass. There was a violation of the uniqueness constraint at the database level. So let's go to users.yaml. This is our fixture. I can show you where it is. It's in test fixtures users.yaml right here. Right now it's empty. So what we want to do is create a user in here that has a known email and password. So the way to do this is with these sort of key value pairs. So this is a hash essentially. This is the key. And you can see the YML ending here, the file name extension, that's YAML. So this is a way to write hashes. And this looks familiar, perhaps, because this is what the debug information uses. So this is the key Michael is the name of the user, and then let's give it a name. Michael example. And the email is michael@example.com. And now we have a problem, though, because we'd like to put in a password. It's going to be like this. But this will not work. This is not valid. Try this here. So you can see that our test is red here. And that's because there's an active record statement invalid exception being raised. You can see here what's going on. Table users has no column named password. And that's true. The password is a virtual attribute on the user model created by HasSecurePassword. The thing that exists in the database is password digest. But we can't use password here because this is not a valid digest. So what we're going to have to do is actually add a digest method to the user model. So let's get started with that. I can show you how this is going to play out. We're going to use a special setup method to create a user. So @user is equal to users of the symbol Michael. This pulls the user out of the user.yaml, users.yaml. So this creates a user. We're going to pull it out with this. And then what we're going to do is we're going to post the login path with the email corresponding to the user. And the password, well, we can't actually put the attribute on the user. That's invalid. So what we're going to do is do the next best thing and just standardize on the word password. We're going to say that all users in the test database will have the password of just the string password. So what we want to do here is have some sort of digest, and we can actually put embedded Ruby in here. So this is a digest of some sort. In order to get this digest to work, we do have to drill into the cryptographic hash library that we're using as part of HasSecurePassword, which is bcrypt. Let me just show you how that works. Go here. So I've got a link here to the source code for HasSecurePassword. This is the sort of thing that you wouldn't necessarily want to look at this at this stage, but I just want to show you that I'm not just pulling this out of thin air. If we look at the digest, there is this line here. You can create a password like this using bcrypt password.create, and there's a cost function. So the cost is a reference here to the computational cost. And ordinarily, bcrypt is very computationally expensive, which is a good thing. That's what makes it hard to attack. If somebody wants to create a bunch of hashes to try to attack a website by, say, matching one of the digests in the database, it's just computationally prohibitive. But inside a test, we want the cost to be small because we don't care about security here. What we care about is speed. So this line here is what does that. It calculates the cost. So I'm just going to create a digest method. Let's go over here to the user model. And I'm going to make this a class method because we actually don't have access to a user inside of here. So this is going to be a class method, and there are several ways to do this, but the most understandable at this stage is like this, user.digest. So we'll be able to invoke it just like this. In fact, we could do this here, just paste it in. So this is what it's going to look like. And we're going to give it an argument. Remember, I said we're going to standardize that all of the users in the test database will just have a password of the string password. So user.digest takes in an argument, which is a string. And then we're going to calculate the cost, which we're just going to paste in. Just paste this in. And I don't like the formatting here, so I'm going to put in a new line. This is kind of a weird syntax. We will be talking about this later, this question mark colon syntax. But for now, let's just pretend that we learned it by looking inside of this file here. And then we can create a password like this. Do this here. This is the string, and then the cost is the cost. So this takes in a string and returns the bcrypt digest, and so since we're calling it here with the password, now this user will have the right digest for that password. So let's save it. And over here, now we can actually get this to work. So we're going to post to the login path, and now we can make some assertions. So what happens when we successfully log in? Well, we should be redirected to the user. Do that with assert redirected to. So this is to the user profile page, so we can just do @user. Remember that's in here. We're just doing this here. It's not user's controller, it's a sessions controller. So we log in successfully, we get redirected to the user, and now we're going to follow that redirect with follow redirect bang, and that should then render the show page for the user. So after logging in successfully, the link to the login path, that's to say this link here, actually I can't even log out, can I? Let me just do this here. I'm going to open up an incognito window. This incognito window has no cookies in it, so you can see here's the login link. So we want this login link to disappear. So we're going to assert that there is no such link. Remember we did this with assert select, so that we can look over here. Remember the layout links test, or the site layout test here. So we had an assert select, this sort of thing, root path count 2, that checked for both of these links here, the link of the logo and this link here, the home link. So now we're going to say assert select, the same sort of thing, this ahref equals question mark, and then we want it to be the login path, and there should be 0 of them. That means there aren't any. But we would like to say that the log out path and the profile path, which is the user's path, will appear. So let's look at this. So that's these links here, the profile here and the log out. Let's do those. And we can just copy this here. This is going to be the user path. So you think maybe we could do this, but in this context, we actually do have to say user path. It's a little tricky. Save it and see if it passes. Great, so it's green. That means that this is a good test for those layout links changing. In fact, we can go over here and we can even do this. If logged in and false, can have it skip those. Should go red. There it is, went red. Because the login link, it should have count 0, but it has count 1. So it's cool. There's one more minor refinement I'd like to make before moving on, which is that right now, when users sign up, you can look in here, users controller, they're not in fact also signed in. So a user who signs up now on the application will have to log in right away, which is really annoying. So we can fix that just by putting a login right here. So we've got, here's the sessions controller. Oops, this is sessions helper. Right, so we log in the user like this. Here we can do the same thing, except with the @user. So this will log the user in, and we can write a test for that. Let's look in the user sign-up test. So with valid sign information, we assert that the template is the user show page,
And what we'd like to do here is say something like assert that the user is logged in. Now you might be tempted at this point to try to use the sessions helper, but that will not work in general because the tests differ in certain subtle ways from the application. So we're actually going to define a new helper called isLoggedIn, ? And that's going to go in the test helper. And if you get lost here, go ahead and just open this up and go to test helper. So we're going to put in a method here. You can see it says add more helper methods to be used by all tests here. We did edit this before when we were setting up the advanced testing, but maybe you didn't do that. So this is the place where we put in helper methods that get used in all the tests. So inside of tests, we're going to check to see if a user is logged in by checking the session. So the session of user ID should not be nil. So the session helper. It's slightly different from this. This will not work in general inside of tests, but this will. So session of user ID. And actually, I want to put a comment in here, documentation comment. So let's save this and save this. And we're green. So we can also comment this out if you want to see how that works. So that's red because this is failing. And now we can uncomment it and we'll go green. There we go. There's only one thing left to do to finish a working login and authentication system, which is to be able to log users out. See over here that we've got account logout, but it doesn't currently do anything. In fact, it just raises an error. The way to do that is to go into the sessions controller. And we're going to fill in this destroy action. So what do we do to log users in? Let's recall that. Logging users in involves calling this login method, which then goes to here and sets the session. So I want to do a corresponding log out. And then after logging out, let's redirect somewhere. Redirecting to the home page is probably the best thing to do. That's the root URL. Remember, often we do root path, but with redirects it should be the URL helper, so it's a fully qualified URL. So this just pushes the logout functionality into the sessions helper. So let's define a logout helper. And so we're just going to undo this login basically. So login sets the session, which is reversible like this. Do the session dot delete and then give it the key that we set before, which is user ID. You can also do this, by the way. I should show you. You might see this in other people's code. Right, this is the same thing. But there is a delete method on this session helper, so we might as well use it. And then there's a second thing which is not strictly necessary because we're about to redirect. But in principle, it could be a minor security hole if we had an @current_user variable lying around. Remember, it's memoized. So if we were to call current user somewhere before the destroy action, and if we didn't redirect immediately, then there would be an @current_user variable lying around. That's an unlikely combination, but I think because it's security related, it's a good idea to set this current user to nil. Let's do this. So this completes the logout. This is actually going to work now. You can check that here. Go back here, reload the page, count, logout. Nope, that did not work. Why didn't that work? Oh, I didn't save this here. So save the sessions controller. Here we go.
There we go. So we got redirected, and you can see that the links got changed too. So I can log in. Oops. Log out. There we go. So I think it's a good idea at this point, now that this is working, to write a quick test to capture that behavior. And let's see, it's in the user's login test. I can just show you where it is, just to reinforce it. Test. It's an integration test, user's login test here. So this will be login with valid information. And after the login, I'm going to say it's valid information followed by logout. We are going to write a helper eventually to log users inside of tests, but right now we're just going to use this post login path that we have inside this test. This gives us a way to defer writing that helper until later. All right, let's look at the test helper. Again, just to reinforce where it is. It's in test. You'd think it'd be in test helpers, but it's actually just in test helper right here. So remember, we defined this as logged in helper. So now that we've got that, I'm just going to put in a line here. After you post the login path, you should be logged in. Should make it an assertion. Here's our guard window. Save that. So after logging in, I want to log out. And the way we do that is we issue a delete request to the logout path. So at that point, we should not be logged in. So we can assert not logged is logged in. And then what do we have here? Over here, we've got a redirect. So let's assert that redirect happens correctly. Assert redirected to root URL. And then let's follow the redirect and verify that these links have changed back to what they should be when the user isn't logged in. So this is follow redirect, bang, and then let's just copy these. So these should be the same assertions, except instead of the count of this being 0, the other one should be 0. So the login path link should reappear, and these should both disappear. So let's just tab this over. Great. So now we've got a nice test for the thing I just did here, where I did log in, the links change, log out, the links change back. Let's run a full test suite just to be sure that we're still green completely. There we go. All right. All right, at this point we have a fully functional basic login system. This is an updated conclusion using the new branch name here, basic login. So we're going to deploy this to production as usual. Check out the master branch and merge in the basic login branch. And then we can push it up. Let's run the test suite first. I could use guard too, it's running in this tab, but this will work. Push it up. And then push it up to Heroku. And let's check it out. All right, looks like it's there. Let's log in using the username and password from the last lesson. And there it is, logging in production. As I mentioned in the introduction, this is a fully functional login system, totally appropriate for a production website. But I do recommend proceeding to the next lesson, Advanced Login, where we'll learn how to use cookies to implement a Remember Me functionality.
which will remember our users even if they close their browsers before revisiting the site.